There's a particular kind of silence that doesn't feel empty. Most silences are gaps, pauses where something used to be or where something hasn't arrived yet. They're passive. They sit there doing nothing, waiting for a word or a sound to fill them and become relevant again. But this silence was different. It had gravity. I know, that sounds like the sort of thing someone says when they're trying to dress up an ordinary observation into something quotable. I've been guilty of that. Ask my editor. Ask anyone who's ever sat across from me at a dinner table when I've had 2 glasses of wine and a decent story to tell. But I'm not dressing this up. I was there. I watched it happen over the course of 3 days, and by the end of the 3rd day, I'd stopped trying to explain it and started just accepting it. Some silences have weight. This one could have crushed you. The assignment started, as most of my less glamorous assignments do, with a phone call I almost didn't pick up. It was a Tuesday in early March. The kind of March that London does when it's feeling particularly vindictive. Not cold enough to be dramatic, not warm enough to be kind, just gray and damp and persistent in the way that only English weather manages without ever actually apologizing for itself. I was eating leftover curry on my sofa, watching a documentary about deep-sea fish when my phone buzzed across the cushion. I stared at it. The number was the foreign desk at the paper, which meant it was either something interesting or something terrible, and at 8:30 on a Tuesday evening with cold curry in my lap, I was not emotionally prepared for either. I picked up. "There's a trade delegation arriving Thursday," said my editor, Priya, without preamble, because Priya doesn't do preamble. Roshan Mirza, senior diplomat, secondary Eastern Bloc, economic ministry. Significant enough for a Foreign Office reception, but not quite significant enough for the full Buckingham treatment. He's doing the changing of the guard as a cultural courtesy, then a private reception at Clarence House. I want color. The gap between what official visits look like and what they actually feel like. "Who's the guard?" I asked. "Does it matter?" "It usually does." She was quiet for exactly 1 second. "His name is Guardsman Thomas Hale, 23, from Shropshire, 2 years in, clean record, no prior incidents." 23 from Shropshire doesn't sound like the basis of a color piece. It didn't, she said, until 3 different people in the diplomatic advance team mentioned him by name in their preliminary briefings. I put the curry down. By name. I arrived at Wellington Barracks on Thursday morning at 6:30. The light was the color of a bruise trying to heal, that uncertain purple-gray that London does in early spring when the sun is technically present but has decided not to commit. A handful of other journalists and photographers were already gathered near the permitted cordon, breath steaming, coffee cups in hand, the particular weary alertness of people who have been doing this long enough to stop being excited about it, but haven't yet stopped caring. I found my spot near the iron railing and watched the preparation begin. There's something about watching the household division prepare for ceremonial duty that does something to you even when you've seen it before. It shouldn't, rationally. You know it's a choreographed performance refined over centuries. Know that every movement is rehearsed to millimeter precision. Know that the bearskins are hot and the tunics are tight, and that someone, somewhere behind all that ceremony, is a 23-year-old lad from Shropshire who probably has opinions about football and eats cereal for dinner. And yet, the moment the formation moves, something in your chest moves with it. I have interviewed prime ministers, I have stood in conflict zones, I have watched things I will not write about in a piece like this, and still, something about this particular stillness, this deliberate human discipline, does something animal and involuntary to the observer. Makes you straighten up. Makes you quieter. I spotted Thomas Hale almost immediately. Not because he looked different. He didn't. Not at first. Same scarlet tunic, same bearskin, same polished brass, same immovable posture that the whole formation shared. But there was something in the economy of him. Where some of the other guards had a quality of tension, controlled, managed tension, the kind that required active effort, Hale had something else. The stillness wasn't costing him anything. That's what I noticed. The difference between a man holding himself still and a man who simply was still. One is a performance. The other is a condition. I wrote nothing down yet. Just watched. The diplomatic motorcade arrived at 8:52. 3 vehicles. Low profile by state visit standards. No motorcycle outriders, no Category 1 security cordon. The advance team had requested minimal ceremony, which the Foreign Office had interpreted, in its particular fashion, as merely a slightly shorter version of maximum ceremony. Roshan Mirza stepped out of the second vehicle. He was a compact man in his mid-50s, well-dressed in the careful way of people who have learned that clothing is a diplomatic instrument. Dark suit, no tie, which was either a deliberate signal or a personal preference. I couldn't tell yet. His face was composed in the patient, watchful expression of a man who has attended a great many ceremonies in a great many countries and learned to look genuinely interested in all of them without actually being distracted by any. He was flanked by 2 aides and a Foreign Office liaison named Gerald, who moved with the apologetic efficiency of a man perpetually 15 seconds behind where he needs to be. The changing began. I kept half my attention on the ceremony and half on Mirza. He watched the formation with polite attention, the same expression he would have worn watching a ballet he hadn't chosen. One of his aides leaned in twice to murmur something. Context, probably historical background, the kind of thing the advance brief would have included. Mirza nodded both times, looked back at the formation. Then something shifted. I almost missed it. It was the moment when the relief formation reached its post and the outgoing guard executed the formal exchange. Standard. Ceremonial. Practiced 10,000 times. But at the precise moment of the exchange, the moment when the formation stood in absolute, locked stillness before the movement resumed, Mirza's composure changed. Not dramatically, not in any way that Gerald or the aides seemed to register. But I saw it. He leaned forward, slightly, an inch, maybe less. The polite visitor's posture dropped, and something more focused came in behind it. His eyes moved to the still point of the formation, to Hale, who stood at the right flank, bearskin forward, chin level, the image of a man who had evacuated himself from his own face. Mirza stared at him for 7 full seconds. I counted because I'd already started noting the odd things. 7 seconds of a diplomat of 20-plus years' experience forgetting, briefly, that he was supposed to look engaged by the whole ceremony, and not fixated on one particular soldier. Then, Gerald said something. Mirza looked away. The polite attention returned. I circled the word fixated in my notebook. The reception at Clarence House began at 11. I had a press credential that extended to the outer reception rooms. Not the private meeting itself, but the anteroom where aides and minor functionaries circulated before and after. The kind of room where you can learn more in 45 minutes than you can in a formal briefing, because people in antechambers talk to fill the waiting. Mirza's aide, a young woman named Dina, quick-eyed and precise in her answers, found me near the window. "You were at the barracks this morning," she said. It wasn't a question. You noticed. She said the way people say something when they've been waiting for someone to say it first. The way he looked at the guard? Yes. She glanced at the door. He mentioned him on the drive over. Ale. He didn't know the name yet. He said. She paused, appeared to be deciding how much was appropriate. Then, something in her seemed to settle. He said, "That soldier in the ceremony. The one who is actually still. Find out who he is. Lots of those guards are still." "That's the I know," she said. "I know that." And I told him. He said, "Not like that one." She excused herself when one of the senior aides made eye contact with her from across the room. I stood at the window and looked out at the courtyard and thought about the difference between a man holding himself still and a man who simply was still. By midday, Gerald, who had the slightly deflated look of a man whose morning had not gone according to the brief, told me what had happened inside. I'm paraphrasing, and Gerald would later tell me I could use this, though he asked I not directly attribute the part about the ministers. Mirza's meeting with the junior trade minister had been polite and procedural. Fine. Standard. When it concluded, Mirza had asked, through his interpreter, if it would be possible to see the guardsman from the ceremony. Not to speak to him, not for any meeting or exchange, simply to see him in his post if the schedule permitted. Gerald said the junior minister had looked at the senior minister with the particular expression that passes between British civil servants when something outside the established protocol appears on the horizon, a sort of collective bracing, like a formation of their own. It hadn't been possible that day. Posts don't accommodate diplomatic requests. Hill was on duty, and the duty doesn't bend. Mirza had nodded, thanked them, then said, "Of course, a man like that doesn't move for preference." That is the point. Gerald told me he'd written the phrase down verbatim. So did I. A man like that doesn't move for preference. That is the point. That evening I found what I could about Thomas Hale, which wasn't much because 23-year-old guardsmen from Shropshire don't accumulate a lot of public record, and the Ministry of Defense has a sensible habit of keeping its ceremonial personnel out of the press. What I had was enlisted at 21, selected for the Household Division after initial training, posted to the 1st Battalion Grenadier Guards, no incident reports, commended once for conduct during a public order situation that the Mod Press Office described as minor in a way that suggested it was not minor. I found one old photo from a local Shropshire paper, a leavers piece from his secondary school, 6 years ago. A lean boy with his mother's arm around him, grinning in that slightly self-conscious way of people who aren't sure whether they're allowed to look happy yet. I looked at that photo for a while. Then I looked back at my notebook at the words I'd circled and underlined throughout the morning. Fixated. Not like that one. A man like that doesn't move for preference. That is the point. There's a story forming, I thought. I'm not sure yet what it is, but I was sure it wasn't about a diplomatic reception. It was about what a particular kind of silence looks like to a man who has spent a career navigating rooms full of noise, calculated noise, performative noise, the noise of ministers who speak to fill space and call it negotiation. It was about what it does to such a man when he encounters, entirely by accident, a 23-year-old from Shropshire who is just, genuinely, still. On the second morning, Mirza changed his schedule. Not dramatically. The diplomatic program has the structural rigidity of load-bearing architecture. You don't remove a beam without checking what falls. But there are always margins. Small flexibilities that the advance team builds in for exactly the kind of contingency that can't be anticipated in a brief. A host who wants to extend lunch, a political development that requires a sidebar, a minister who is 20 minutes late and doesn't apologize. Mirza used his margin to walk. He told Gerald he wanted to see the area, on foot. Gerald, who had been in the Foreign Office long enough to recognize the phrase, "I want to see the area on foot," as a diplomatic code for "I want to think without being monitored," arranged a small protective detail and a route that took them along the mall in the direction of the palace. I know this because one of the junior members of the detail talked to me later the way junior members of protective details sometimes do when they're not entirely certain what they witnessed and need to process it by telling someone. His name was Marcus. Mid-20s, ex-military, the kind of physical composure that protection work tends to produce. He told me the walk was quiet for the first 10 minutes. Mirza moved at a deliberate pace, hands clasped behind his back, eyes doing that panoramic cataloging thing that experienced diplomats do, logging everything without appearing to study anything. Then, they reached the section of the mall where the guard post was visible. Hill was on duty again. Same post. Same stillness. Mirza stopped walking. The protective detail adjusted around him. Gerald, half a pace behind, nearly walked into Mirza's shoulder and recovered with the practiced grace a man who has spent a career navigating other people's unexpected pauses. "How long has he been standing there?" Mirza asked. No one was immediately certain who he was addressing. Marcus told me there was a beat, a brief collective recalibration, before Gerald said that the post-rotation was approximately 90 minutes on duty, 30 off, and that this particular guardsman had likely been at his post for around 40 minutes. 40 minutes, Mirza said. Not as a question, more like a man confirming a calculation he'd already made in his head. He stood there for another 2 minutes. Just looked. Marcus said it was the longest 2 minutes of the walk, not because anything was happening, but because of the quality of attention Mirza was giving. The kind of attention usually reserved for things that are moving or changing, applied instead to perfect stillness. Then Mirza said, "In my ministry, We have a word for men who speak and say nothing. We have 17 words for men who negotiate badly. We have expressions, idioms, very old phrases going back to the court, all describing the various ways a person can make noise and mean less than silence. He paused. We do not have a word for this. He gestured once, slightly, with his right hand in the direction of Hale. Then he walked on. Marcus told me that story at a pub near Victoria 2 days after the delegation had left. He nursed a pint he didn't really drink and talked in the careful way of someone parsing what's permissible, what's shareable, and what's just the residue of an experience that lodged somewhere and won't shift. "You've got to understand," he said, "I've done a lot of these. Foreign dignitaries, state visits, the smaller ones like this. Most of them, you're invisible. You're a piece of the furniture, which is fine. That's what you want to be. But this was different." He considered. He talked to us. Not much, but enough. The third day, he asked one of us, Jordan, she was on the left flank. He asked her if she had served. Had she? For years. Army Nurse Corps. What did he say? He said, "I thought so. You have the same quality." And then he just looked forward again. I sat with that for a moment. The same quality as Hale? I assumed so, Marcus said. I mean, what else would he mean? What else? I managed to speak with Gerald properly on the second afternoon, over coffee in a Whitehall establishment that I will charitably describe as aggressively beige. Gerald was the kind of civil servant who had survived 22 years in the Foreign Office by being simultaneously indispensable and uncontroversial, a combination that required either genius or extreme personal self-suppression, and Gerald showed no particular signs of genius. He was, however, more perceptive than his manner suggested. He asked about Hale again, Gerald said, wrapping both hands around his coffee cup in the way of a man who doesn't know what to do with his hands. Second day. I'd anticipated it, actually. Try to prepare a brief on the Guards program, the household division, the selection process, the ceremonial function, the sort of context that usually satisfies this kind of interest. And he listened to all of it, very politely. And then he said, "Yes, I understand the institution. I'm asking about the person." Gerald said the distinction had stopped him. "Because the institution is the person," he said to me, in the slightly defensive tone of a man whose professional world is built on that assumption. That's what the whole program is designed to do. The uniformity, the discipline, the ceremony, it subsumes the individual into the institution. That's the point. You're not meant to be able to separate them. But he could. Gerald looked at his coffee. He seemed to think so. He said, "I wrote this down because I wasn't sure what to make of it." He said, "The institution tells every man to be still. Only some men are, which means the stillness belongs to the man, not the uniform." He looked at me with the expression of someone encountering a sentence that didn't fit the available filing systems. And he said he trusted that. Trusted the stillness? Trusted the man, Gerald said. He was very precise about the distinction. There's a thing that happens in rooms where diplomacy occurs. Real diplomacy, not the television kind, where the person with the least to prove holds the most power. Mirza had been doing this long enough to understand the room. In the trade discussions on the second day, which I had limited and frustrated access to through a combination of press credentials, strategic positioning near an anteroom, and a junior interpreter named Yelena, who was sympathetic to what she called the documentation of atmosphere. The meeting had covered the expected ground. Tariff frameworks, bilateral investment protections, the pleasantries of trade that are never really about trade. What Yelena told me afterward was this. Mirza had been entirely cooperative, entirely warm, and had volunteered almost nothing. The ministers, the junior trade minister and his senior colleague, had talked considerably, filled the space, produced positions, framings, commitments with caveats, the full vocabulary of negotiation as performance. And Mirza had listened, asked one question where 24 were expected, and let the silence after his question do the work that most negotiators assign to follow-up phrasing. The ministers had, Yelena said, found this unsettling and interpreted it as depth. They kept saying he was very thoughtful, she told me, with the particular accent of someone reporting a misunderstanding they found professionally interesting. Very measured, very strategic, very. They used the word inscrutable twice, which I did not translate literally. Why not? She looked at me with the patience of someone who has spent a career finding polite alternatives to honest observations. Because in the context of the meeting, it would have been impolite. And also because I'm not entirely sure they were wrong. I asked her what she thought Mirza was doing in those silences. She thought about it properly, not quickly. I think, she said, he was listening, just listening, which is not the same as being strategic. But in a room full of people performing strategy, it looks like the most strategic thing in the room. That evening, I sat in my hotel room with my notes and tried to write the first draft of something and failed. The failure wasn't for lack of material. I had more material than I needed, more quotes, more scenes, more observed moments than would fit in the allocated word count. The failure was structural. I couldn't find the spine of it, because the story that was emerging wasn't the story I'd been sent to write. I've been sent to write about the gap between what official visits look like and what they feel like. A color piece, human interest, the soft space around the formal record. But what I was finding was something else. I was finding a story about how we mistake one quality for another. Mirza trusted Hale not because Hale was extraordinary, not because Hale had done anything remarkable or revealing. Not because the young guardsman for Shropshire had distinguished himself in any legible way. He trusted him because Hale's silence was not a performance. And Mirza, who had spent a career in rooms full of performed silences, meaningful pauses, strategic reticences, loaded hesitations, could apparently tell the difference. The thing is, I couldn't tell you how. I couldn't tell you the visible marker. I couldn't point to the specific frame in the ceremony or the precise quality in the posture. I could only tell you that 7 different people, Mirza's aide, Marcus, Gerald, Yelena, 2 other members of the protocol team, had all, independently, registered something in Thomas Hale's presence that stopped them, that made them notice, and none of them could describe it in concrete language. That's not nothing. That is, in fact, almost everything. I went back to the barracks that evening. I couldn't get inside. I hadn't expected to, but the public footpath along the perimeter runs close enough that you can stand and watch the guard change if you position yourself at the right angle, and I did that collar up against a wind that had come off the Thames carrying cold intentions and moderate success. Hill was coming off duty. I recognized him from the movement even before the uniform became clear, the same quality of stillness in motion, which is a contradictory thing to say and also exactly accurate. When still men walk, they carry the stillness with them. It doesn't leave. It's not a posture they adopt for the post and shed for the walk back. He was with another guardsman, maybe a year older, and they were talking. I couldn't hear what, just the low register of 2 men having a comfortable, unceremonious conversation. Hale laughed at something. A real laugh. Quick, the kind you don't manage if you're performing. His head went back slightly. I don't know what I'd expected. Some visible quality of the remarkable. Maybe some marker that would let me write. Here, in this specific way, is why a career diplomat noticed him from 40 yards and asked to know his name. There wasn't one. He was a 23-year-old from Shropshire laughing at something his colleague had said, walking back across a barracks courtyard in the March evening, just a person moving through their day. And I thought about what Mirza had said. The institution tells every man to be still. Only some men are, which means the stillness belongs to the man, not the uniform. And I thought, that's it. That's the whole of it. You can instruct stillness. You can train it, rehearse it, install it through drill and repetition until it becomes reflex. But the stillness that Mirza had noticed, the kind that carries weight, the kind that diplomats who have sat in rooms with presidents and warlords and ministers register and cannot immediately name, that kind is not installed. It's already there, or it isn't. And the remarkable thing, the thing that kept me standing on that cold footpath longer than was either necessary or sensible, was this. Roshan Mirza, who by every professional credential and accumulated experience should have been spending his week evaluating ministers, trade frameworks, bilateral commitments, geopolitical positioning, had looked at Thomas Hale and said, That one. Not any minister. That one died on the third day it happened. The meeting that hadn't been on any official schedule, hadn't been in any advance brief, hadn't been arranged through any of the protocol channels that Gerald monitored with the vigilance of a man who considers unscheduled meetings a personal affront. It happened because Mirza asked for it. He asked Gerald at 8:15 in the morning, before the formal program resumed, if it would be possible to meet the guardsman. Not observe, not pass by, meet. Gerald told me afterward that he had, in 22 years, never received a request quite in that form. State guests, dignitaries, visiting heads of department. They sometimes asked to meet specific members of the household division after incidents, or on the anniversary of something, or as a formal courtesy. There were protocols for that. There were channels. There was no protocol for a diplomat of Mirza seniority making a quiet, personal, informal request to spend a few minutes with a 23-year-old ceremonial guard because he had watched him standing at a post and seen something he couldn't name. Gerald, credit to him, didn't say no. He said he would inquire, which is the Foreign Office's version of yes with extra steps. It took 3 hours and a phone call to someone Gerald described only as further up the chain than I'm comfortable being. At 11:20, Thomas Hale was informed that a member of a visiting diplomatic delegation had requested a brief informal meeting, that it was entirely voluntary on his part, and that his CO had approved it as a diplomatic courtesy if he was willing. Hale said yes. I found that out from Dina, Mirza's aide, who I had by the third day established a reasonable working understanding with. She was too careful to be a source in any traditional sense, but she had the quality of wanting the story to be told accurately enough that she'd fill in gaps when accuracy required it. She said Hale's reaction had surprised her. I expected, I don't know. Nerves? Hesitation? He's young, and Mirza is not a minor figure, and it's a strange request. He wasn't nervous? She paused. He said, all right when, just that, all right when. The meeting lasted 14 minutes. I wasn't in the room. No press were, no aides, no Gerald, by the accounts of everyone who was nearby. It was Mirza's specific and quietly insistent request that it be the two of them alone, which Gerald had accommodated with the expression of a man folding a map in a direction he'd never tried. They met in a small anteroom off one of the service corridors of Clarence House, which Dina described as the least ceremonially appropriate room in the building. Beige walls, 2 chairs that didn't match, a window that looked out onto a utility courtyard where someone had left a bicycle leaning against a drain pipe. 14 minutes. No interpreter because Mirza's English is excellent and had been throughout the visit. No note-taker. No third presence. What I know about those 14 minutes comes from 2 sources. Dina, who spoke with Mirza immediately after, and the protection officer Marcus, who was positioned just outside the door and had, with the particular situational alertness of protective detail work, paid attention without meaning to. Marcus told me it was almost entirely quiet. Not silent, there was conversation. Low, even tones, the register of 2 people talking rather than performing, which sounds different through a door than you'd think. But the overall texture of the 14 minutes was what Marcus described with the slightly apologetic vocabulary of a man who doesn't usually traffic in this kind of observation, as mostly just the absence of sound. He heard Mirza laugh once. A genuine laugh, low and brief, the kind that doesn't travel far. He heard what he thought. He wasn't certain. Was Hale saying something about Shropshire? And at the 11-minute mark, he heard Mirza say, in a voice clear enough to carry, yes. That's exactly it. That's all Marcus had. Dina gave me more. She said Mirza had come out of the anteroom with the specific composure of a man who has just had a conversation that settled something he'd been carrying. Not resolved it, settled it. The way you settle a question by accepting the terms of it rather than finding the answer. He'd said 3 things to her before the protocol day resumed. First, he is very young. Second, he has not read a single book about how to carry himself. You can always tell. Third, and she said this was the one she'd written down because she wasn't immediately sure she'd understood it. He doesn't know why he trusts people. He hasn't had to make it a decision yet. That's the last part to go. She said she'd asked Mirza what he meant. He had smiled. The specific smile, she said, that he saved for questions he was going to answer obliquely, and said, "When you're new to this work, trust is a feeling. After a long time, it becomes a calculation. You learn to make the calculation so quickly that you forget it was ever a feeling." He is still in the feeling. I wanted to remember what that looked like. I sat with that for a very long time. I sat with it on the tube back to my flat that evening. I sat with it at my desk at midnight with my third cup of tea and my notebook open to the page where I'd transcribed Dina's words twice to make sure I had them right. I sat with it for most of the next week, through 2 failed draft attempts and one conversation with Priya in which she said, with the impatience of someone whose patience is a finite and professional resource, "I need the piece by Friday. I don't need your existential relationship to the piece." She was right, as she usually is. But here's the thing I couldn't file without including, the thing that made every draft feel incomplete until I figured out how to say it. The story everyone else was telling, the aides, the protocol team, the junior ministers who heard secondhand about the diplomat's unusual interest in the guardsmen. That story was about the comedy of it, the charm of it, the slightly absurd image of a serious diplomat choosing the company of a 23-year-old guard over the formal company of the ministers arranged for his benefit. That was the version of the story that had legs. That was the headline. Diplomat trusts guard more than ministers. Human interest. Warm. A little funny. The kind of thing that makes the rounds and gets a smile and then is forgotten. But that wasn't what had happened. What had happened was this. Roshan Mirza had spent close to 3 decades in rooms where intelligence was performed, where the appearance of thinking carefully was deployed as a negotiating instrument, where silence was a tactic, composure was a costume, and the most dangerous person in any meeting was the one whose stillness was most convincingly strategic. He had become expert at reading performance. And in the process, this is my interpretation, but I believe it, in the process, he had become a little unsure of non-performance. A little unable, when confronted with the unperformed version of a quality, to trust that it was real. Because everything in his world had a motive. Every silence had a reason. Every composed face had a calculation running behind it. He had been so thoroughly educated in the architecture of strategic behavior that genuine behavior had started to look like a variant he hadn't identified yet. Then, he'd watched Thomas Hale stand at a ceremonial post on a gray March morning in London. And something in the architecture had recognized something that was not architecture. Not a performance of stillness. Not a cultivated display of discipline deployed for effect. Just a young man from Shropshire who was wired in a particular way, who had found in the army, and specifically in this particular duty, a structure that matched some internal quality he'd had long before he put on the uniform, and who stood at his post with the absolute, unconditional reality of someone who wasn't thinking about how they looked. Mirza trusted that, not because it was intelligence, not because stillness is wisdom, or because silence is depth, or because the absence of noise means the presence of anything particular. He trusted it because in a world of calculations presenting themselves as feelings, he had suddenly encountered a feeling that had not yet been converted into a calculation. And he recognized it, because he remembered it, because it was what he'd been before 28 years of rooms. I filed the piece on a Friday morning. Priya called at noon. "It's good," she said, in the tone she uses when she means it. "Different to what I asked for. Is that a problem?" A pause. "No," she said. "The thing I asked for would have been fine. This is truer." She ran it the following Tuesday. The headline they used was not "Diplomat Trust Guard More Than Ministers." That had been the suggested line from the foreign desk, slightly arch, slightly playful, the version that would get shared. They used it for the social posts and the summary. But the headline Priya gave the piece itself, after a long editorial call that I was not invited to, was quieter. It was the last part to go. I thought about calling her to say thank you for that, and didn't because Priya doesn't do sentiment over headlines and would have found it embarrassing. But I thought it. I heard from Dina once more, about 6 weeks after the delegation had returned home. A short message through the paper's diplomatic desk. "No formalities. Just, Mirza asked me to tell you." He read the piece. He said you got the order of the things right. I didn't reply immediately. I wasn't sure what to say. Eventually I wrote back. Tell him I was only reporting what I saw. She replied, He said that's what he meant. I don't know what Thomas Hale thought about any of it. I made one attempt to reach him through the Mod Press office, which replied with the exact warmth and enthusiasm you'd expect from a Ministry of Defense press office regarding a ceremonial guardsman who has not been involved in any incident reportable under Mod guidelines, which is to say, professionally declining without malice. I respected that. Some stories don't need the subject's commentary. Some stories are about what was seen, not about what was felt by the person being seen. Hale had stood at his post and been himself, and a diplomat from the other side of the world had looked at him from 40 yards across a gray London morning and seen something that stopped a career. Hale didn't know it at the time. Might not know it now, which is, I think, the point. The quality that Mirza recognized, the last quality to go, the one that precedes calculation, is not enhanced by knowing it's being observed. It's not a performance that improves with an audience. It exists precisely in the absence of that awareness. The moment Hale knows he's being watched for it, the moment he begins to think about how he carries himself rather than just carrying himself, that's when it becomes architecture. Shropshire is a quiet county. I drove through it once, years ago, on the way somewhere else. I remember long fields and hedgerows and the specific English rural quiet that has a texture to it, a density like sound has been present so long in its absence that the air remembers it. I thought about that on the Tuesday the piece ran. I thought about a boy growing up in that kind of quiet, learning it, carrying it inside, enlisting at 21 and discovering in the improbable setting of gold braid and bearskin and ceremonial precision that the quiet he'd brought with him from Shropshire was not an obstacle to the life he was building. It was the whole of what the life required. The last thing I'll say is this. There's a version of this story where the lesson is about the limits of formal intelligence, about how credentialed ministers with prepared briefs can be outflanked by a guardsman who said nothing. And that version is satisfying. It has the shape of a parable. It offers a clean takeaway. I don't entirely believe it. I think the truth is more careful. I think Mirza was not naive about the ministers. He was doing his job with them and doing it well, and the trade discussions came to the conclusions the Foreign Office had anticipated. The ministers were not failures. The diplomacy was not a failure. What happened with Hale was not a rebuke to the ministers. It was something separate, something personal, something that fell outside the category of the professional visit entirely. A man who had been doing a particular kind of work for a long time had looked across a courtyard at a young man, being unself-consciously himself, and had felt something that his work had gradually made rare. Not trust in the contractual sense. Not trust as a diplomatic calculation or a strategic asset or an institutional evaluation. Just the simple, animal, almost forgotten sensation of recognizing something real and being moved by it. Not because it was useful, because it was true.